This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report, music by Eddie Gale. We're broadcasting on over 800 stations on Pacific and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations, on public access TV and PBS TV stations and both TV satellite networks, Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. Among the PBS stations we're broadcasting on is SOP TV, which is Southern Oregon Public Television, where we're broadcasting from today in Medford, Oregon. As we turn now to the best-selling author of The Shock Doctrine, yes, author and independent journalist Naomi Klein joins us from Toronto, Canada, to talk about the latest shocks to the economy. And with the climate summit in Copenhagen just 2 weeks away, the coming together of a global movement for climate justice. She is just out with the 10th anniversary edition of her first book, the international bestseller No Logo. And her latest articles include Climate Rage for Rolling Stone magazine and Copenhagen, Seattle Grows Up for the Nation. Naomi Klein, welcome to Democracy Now! Let's begin with the issue of climate change and, as you put it, climate rage. Tell us what's happening.
Well, that piece in Rolling Stone is looking at a growing demand for the repayment of climate debt. And this is really a relatively new framing for the climate crisis, and it's coming predominantly from the developing world, led by the government of Bolivia and other Latin American governments, and it's been joined by the coalition of least developed countries, which are primarily in Africa. And essentially what they're saying is that the climate crisis, as we know, was created in the industrialized world. There's a direct correlation between industrialization, but what we call development, and carbon emissions. In fact, 75% of the historical carbon emissions have been produced by only 20% of the world's population. And then we have this cruel geographical irony, which is that the effects of climate change are felt overwhelmingly in the developing world, in the parts of the world that are least responsible for creating the crisis. So according to the World Bank, 75 to 80% of the effects of climate change are being felt in the developing world. So you have this inverse relationship between cause and effect. So it is in this context that we're seeing a growing movement from the developing countries that really are on the front lines of climate change, saying that the rich world that created this climate crisis owes them a debt, owes them tangible reparations for the creation of this crisis. And those reparations should be paid in three forms. First, through deep emission cuts in the developed world, in the rich world, 40%, at least 40% below 1990 levels. This is a figure we've heard a lot. In addition to this, they're saying that the rich world, the G8 countries, the industrialized countries, should pay for the costs, the huge costs that poor countries face in adapting to climate change. And in addition to that, they're also saying that they would like to leapfrog over the dirty energies, the fossil fuels that are fueling the climate crisis, but they point out that this is expensive, that it's more expensive to shift to cleaner green technology than it is to develop with cheap, dirty fuels, which is the way that we did in the rich world. So they're saying we will change, but we don't think we should have to pay this additional cost because of a problem that is not of our creation. So essentially the climate debt argument is the polluter pays argument, which is a familiar argument to people in the United States. It's a basic principle of jurisprudence, and they're saying, another way of putting it is you broke it, you bought it.
Talk specifically about the countries that are raising these concerns and saying we shouldn't have to pay, for example, in Africa.
Well, the African Union, the coalition of African states, have been very clear that their primary demand out of Copenhagen are these deep emission cuts and serious funding for adaptation to climate change. And in Eastern Africa right now, you have massive, you have serious droughts affecting millions of people. That's just one example of the kind of costs that are being incurred because of climate change already. So we're not talking about projecting into the future, some hypothetical future. We're talking about right now. But the main push, as I said, is actually coming from Bolivia, and Bolivia has an extraordinary climate negotiator who I quote in the Rolling Stone piece named Angelica Navarro, who I first met in Geneva. She was actually Bolivia's ambassador to the World Trade Organization. She's very clear, very tough, multilingual. It takes a lot of strength to stand up to the sort of pressure that a small country like Bolivia faces, whether at the World Trade Organization or now in the climate negotiations. And Angelica Navarro is really up to the task, and she has been giving these really inspiring speeches at summits in the lead up to Copenhagen, and has really been a galvanizing force for other developing countries. But also, she's taking a demand that is coming from groups like the Third World Network, Focus on the Global South, Jubilee South, coalitions of NGOs and climate justice groups that have been making these demands on the outside of summits. But what's interesting now is that these demands have entered inside the summit. They're at the negotiating table. And of course, there's extraordinary resistance from the United States and the European Union, Canada, Australia, to the idea that they shouldn't just be giving money to the developing world to adapt to climate change, to deal with climate change, out of the goodness of our hearts, out of a sense of charity, but actually out of a legal obligation. And this is a frightening concept, as you can imagine.
Naomi Klein,
but the case for it, Amy, is very strong. Just to add it, sorry.
Last week, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon rejected widespread predictions that the summit in Copenhagen would be a failure.
Reading the latest news reports, however, you might think that Copenhagen is destined to be a disappointment. That is wrong. To the contrary, we can, and I believe we will, reach a deal in Copenhagen that sets the stage for a binding treaty as soon as possible.
Your response to what Ban Ki-moon is saying?
Well, the problem is that the definition of success in Copenhagen has been lowered and lowered. A few months ago, the definition of success in Copenhagen was countries agreeing to lower emissions to levels that climate scientists were demanding, and the science is very, very clear that we really do need cuts of 40% below 1990 levels. The other definition of success was rich countries coming to the table with levels of funding for the developing world that once again meet the actual need. And we know what those types of figures are. The World Bank, for instance, has estimated that the cost faced by developing countries to simply adapt to a changing climate, dealing with droughts, dealing with increased flooding, is $100 billion a year. The cost of leapfrogging over those dirty energies, as I was saying earlier, that's $500 to $600 billion a year. That's a figure from independent UN researchers. But now what we're hearing from the UN is their hope for Copenhagen is that they can get developed countries, rich countries, to agree to $10 billion a year. So, Amy, they'll turn around and say that that is a success, but that's simply not a success. So the definition of success is just being pushed lower and lower. And this is really, this is a troubling issue, and it's an issue that a lot of environmentalists, climate justice activists are going to have to confront, because with an issue like climate change, urgency matters. Maintaining a sense of urgency in the face of this crisis really matters. So there is a danger, a very real danger, of creating an illusion of doing something about the problem in Copenhagen. Having Obama go make another terrific speech, which he's very good at, claiming it's a breakthrough that the U.S. is talking about emission cuts of now they're saying between 14 and 20% below 2005 levels, which is just absurd. It has nothing to do with the science. And then this $10 billion a year figure, which once again, there's such a huge gap between that figure and the lowest possible figure that we're hearing from the World Bank, which is $100 billion. So we have to be very careful about what's called success, because if you turn around and say it's a success to have the U.S. commit to 14% cuts from 2005 levels and to throw in a couple $2 billion a year out of the goodness of their hearts while still not recognizing historical responsibility, then you lose some of this crucial urgency in confronting this crisis. So I think it's very important for the climate justice movement not to allow politicians to pass off failure as success.